War doesn't knock, it storms in, it takes those who cannot refuse. My name is Nathaniel Holloway, and this is the story of the war I carry on my shoulders and in my heart. I was 19 years old when I signed the papers. The recruiter shook my hand and said, "You're doing the right thing, son." My father gave me a silent nod, pride in his eyes. My mother tried to smile, but I saw the shadow of fear in her expression. My younger brother, Josh, looked up at me and asked a question that would echo in my mind for years. "Are you going to be a hero?" I wanted to answer. I didn't know how. On the bus to training camp, we laughed, joked, and told stories. The illusion of youth made us believe we were about to embark on an adventure, but war is not a movie. It doesn't have a heroic soundtrack. It doesn't cut to the next scene when things get too hard. Boot camp was hell. Days started before the sun came up. We ran until our legs burned, carried weights until our arms failed. We learned to shoot, to fight, to kill. We woke up to the screams of our instructors and fell asleep to the sound of our own pounding hearts. "Faster, Holloway! If you stop, you die!" War waits for no one. Some gave up. Others were forced out. Those who remained were reshaped. We lost our softness, our innocence. We weren't just kids looking for something anymore. We became soldiers, machines programmed for one thing, survival. The night before deployment, I sat on my childhood bed, staring at the ceiling. My father walked in, placed a firm hand on my shoulders and said, "No matter what happens, you come back." That was the last thing he said before I boarded the plane. The departure. The air on the plane was heavy, not with turbulence, but with the weight of unspoken thoughts. Some of the guys tried to sleep, their helmets resting on their laps. Others stared at the ceiling, lost in their own heads. A few whispered prayers. I wasn't sure if I believed in God, but I prayed anyway. As I gripped the armrest, I thought of my mother, how her hands shook when she hugged me goodbye, how she whispered, "Be safe," as if saying it out loud could make it true. I thought of Josh, his wide eyes as I walked away, his silent question still burning in my mind. "Are you going to be a hero?" The plane landed under the cover of darkness. We were given no time to reflect, no moment to collect ourselves. The second my boots hit the dirt, I felt it. This was real. The air smelled different. Dust, oil, something burning in the distance. A sergeant barked orders as we moved into formation. The heat pressed against us like a second skin, and the weight of our gear felt heavier than it had in training. "Stay alert. No mistakes. You're not in Kansas anymore." A nervous laugh rippled through the ranks. But it wasn't funny. A convoy was waiting to take us to the base. The ride was long, silent. We passed ruined buildings, twisted metal, remnants of something that once was a city. I watched shadows move between alleyways. Were they civilians? Enemies? Just ghosts? No one spoke. At the base, I barely had time to drop my bag before we were briefed. No easing in, no transition. We were at war. A part of me thought I would have time to adjust. I was wrong. Baptism by fire. The first night felt endless. Every sound, every shadow, every gust of wind sent a wave of adrenaline through my body. I gripped my rifle so tightly that my fingers ached. I barely slept. No one did. Morning came with orders, patrol duty. A routine mission, they said, just getting us used to the area. But there was nothing routine about war. We moved through the streets in formation, eyes scanning rooftops, alleyways, windows, anything that could be a threat. The city was a graveyard of twisted metal and broken concrete, walls scarred with bullet holes, cars reduced to skeletons. The smell of smoke lingered in the air, even though the fires had long been extinguished. And then a shot, sharp, sudden. Too close. We dropped instantly, hugging the ground. My heart pounded in my chest, but my training took over. "Contact! 3 o'clock! Stay low! Return fire! Move! Move!" It wasn't like in the movies. There was no dramatic soundtrack, no slow-motion heroics, just chaos. Bullets ripped through the air, shattering glass, kicking up dust. I pressed myself against a crumbling wall, my breath shallow, my hands trembling around my rifle. I saw a man go down. I didn't know his name. I didn't have time to... Someone screamed for a medic, another shouted for cover. My sergeant grabbed my shoulder and yelled, "Holloway, you want to live? Then move!" And I did. We pushed forward, returning fire, our boots kicking up dirt as we advanced. I don't remember pulling the trigger. I only remember the recoil, the smell of gunpowder, the sound of my own breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. Minutes felt like hours. And then, silence. The gunfire stopped, the dust settled, and we were still standing. I had survived my first battle. But something inside me knew this was only the beginning. The demons of war. War doesn't just take lives. It takes pieces of you, slowly, silently, piece by piece. After the first firefight, we didn't talk much. Back at base, I sat on my cot, staring at my hands. They were still trembling. I tried to will them to stop, but they wouldn't. My body had survived the battle. My mind wasn't so sure. I heard Carter, my closest friend in the unit, let out a long breath as he dropped onto his bunk across from me. "That was real, huh?" "Yeah. You think it gets easier?" "I don't know." The truth, it didn't. The days blurred into nights. The nights stretched endlessly. We patrolled, we fought, we lost men, we moved on. There was no time to grieve, no time to reflect. We barely had time to eat, to sleep. And even when we did, the war followed us. The nights were the worst. I'd lie in my cot, exhausted. But the second I closed my eyes, I was back there. The snap of gunfire, the screams, the dust choking my lungs. The man who went down before I even knew his name. I woke up drenched in sweat, gasping for air. Some nights, I wasn't the only one. I'd hear Carter muttering in his sleep, jerking awake, clutching his rifle like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. None of us talked about it. Not really. We'd sit in silence, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant rumble of explosions miles away. That was the thing about war. It didn't stop just because the sun went down. Letters never sent. I tried writing home once. "Dear Mom, I'm doing fine. Dear Dad, it's not as bad as I thought. Josh, I'll tell you all about it when I get back." I crumpled the paper and tossed it aside. What was I supposed to say? That every step felt like it might be my last. That I wasn't sure if I was fighting to protect my country or just to see another sunrise. So I stopped writing, stopped thinking about home. Because the more you thought about home, the harder it was to survive where we were. The day that changed everything. We had been in country for 6 months when it happened. By then, I had learned the rhythm of war, the way your body moves before your mind has time to think, the way you stop flinching at explosions in the distance, the way you memorize every name of the men in your unit, because you don't know how long they'll be around. We had a routine patrol that morning, just like any other day. We rolled through the outskirts of a city, scanning the rooftops, the alleyways, the windows that were too dark to see through. Something felt off. Carter muttered, "I don't like this." Neither did I. There were no civilians, no kids playing in the streets, no movement at all. And then everything exploded, a deafening roar. The Humvee in front of us lifted off the ground. Shrapnel tore through the air like flying knives. I felt my body leave the seat, weightless for a second, then pain as I slammed into the side of the truck. My ears rang. My vision blurred. My mouth was full of dust and blood. I couldn't hear the shouting. I only saw mouths moving, people dragging others from the wreckage. Then I saw Carter. He was on the ground, motionless, his rifle a few feet away. His eyes were open, but he wasn't there anymore. Something inside me snapped. I crawled toward him, my hands shaking as I grabbed his vest. "Carter, come on, man, Carter!" No response. I felt someone pull me away, shouting something I couldn't hear, but I fought against them. He's still here. He's still here. But he wasn't. That was the day I learned there are worse things than dying in war, worse than bullets, worse than explosions, worse than the nightmares that followed us every night. It was surviving. Surviving meant watching your friends die. Surviving meant carrying their names inside you long after they were gone. Surviving meant waking up every morning knowing they weren't waking up with you. That was the day I stopped believing in heroes. The return home. When my deployment ended, I thought I'd feel relief. I thought stepping onto American soil would make it all go away. The war, the noise, the ghosts. But war doesn't stay behind. It follows you home. The plane landed. As I walked down the ramp, people clapped. A woman handed me a small American flag. Someone patted my back, told me, "Welcome home, soldier." I forced a smile, said thank you. But inside, I felt nothing. I scanned the crowd until I saw them. My mom, my dad, and Josh. My mom had tears in her eyes as she wrapped her arms around me. My dad shook my hand, his grip strong but not as rigid as before. For the first time in my life, I saw softness in his eyes. Josh looked at me carefully, like he didn't recognize me, and maybe he was right. I wasn't the same person who left. The first night back, I lay in my old bed, staring at the ceiling. It was too quiet. No distant gunfire. No orders being shouted. No sound of boots on dirt. Just silence. But silence wasn't peace. Silence was where the war lived now. I closed my eyes, and in an instant, I was back there. The explosion, Carter's body in the dirt. The weight of my rifle in my hands. I sat up fast, gasping for air. My shirt was soaked in sweat. My hands trembled. I wasn't in the desert anymore, but the desert was still inside me. I got up, walked to the window. The street was empty, quiet, too quiet, and then a car backfired. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. My heart pounded, my vision tunneled, my breath quickened. I wasn't on my street anymore. I was back there. I gripped the windowsill, forcing myself to breathe. You're home! You're home! You're home! But part of me wasn't. Part of me never left. The price of freedom. They call us heroes. But heroes don't wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, gasping for air. Heroes don't flinch when they hear fireworks on the 4th of July. Heroes don't scan rooftops for threats when walking through their own neighborhoods. I wasn't a hero. I was a man trying to outrun a war that never ended. The weight of the past. The days blurred together. My mom smiled at me over breakfast, but I could see the worry in her eyes. My dad tried to talk to me, but I barely heard him. And Josh, he stopped asking questions. I think he knew I didn't have answers anymore. I tried to go out, to be normal, but everything felt wrong. The supermarket was too bright. The streets were too loud. People walked past me, laughing, talking about meaningless things. And all I could think about was Carter. Carter would never walk these streets again. Carter would never complain about overpriced coffee. Carter would never feel the sun on his face in the morning. Carter would never hug his mother again, but I could. And that truth felt heavier than the body armor I used to wear. The first nightmare. The first time it happened, I woke up screaming. My mom burst into the room, panic on her face. "Nate, what's wrong? What happened?" I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. I looked at her, standing in the doorway, but I didn't see my mother. I saw dust, blood. Carter's empty eyes staring back at me. My hands trembled as I wiped the sweat from my face. "I'm fine, Mom." I wasn't, but she didn't need to know that. Because what could she do? What could anyone do? This was my war now, and I was fighting it alone. My last mission. I spent weeks pretending I was fine. I forced smiles, answered questions with short, empty words. "Yeah, I'm good." I went through the motions, trying to fit into a life that no longer felt like mine. But the war was still inside me. It was in the way I hesitated before entering a crowded room. It was in the way I jumped at loud noises. It was in the way I carried Carter's name in my chest like a weight I could never put down. One night, I found myself sitting alone in my truck, parked outside my house. The street was dark, empty. The engine hummed softly. I had driven here without even realizing it. My hands gripped the steering wheel. My eyes stared blankly ahead. I could still feel the sand beneath my boots, still hear the distant echoes of war, and for the first time I asked myself, what was I supposed to do now? The talk with my father. The next morning, my father found me sitting on the porch. He sat down beside me, a cup of coffee in his hand. For a long time he didn't say anything. Then, finally, he spoke. I never told you this, but my grandfather fought in World War II. I looked at him. He had never talked about this before. He came home, but he never really left. He carried it with him for the rest of his life. He took a slow sip of coffee. But you know what he did? He told his story. I frowned. What do you mean? My father exhaled. He wrote it down. Every detail, every moment. He said if he kept it inside, it would destroy him. But if he shared it, maybe it could help someone else. I stared at my hands, his words sinking in. Or maybe it's time you do the same. The final decision that night, I picked up a notebook and a pen. At first, I just stared at the blank page. But then, I wrote. I wrote about Carter, about the sand, the heat, the battles, about the men we lost, about the silence that followed, about the nightmares, the guilt, the weight of it all. And as I wrote, something inside me shifted. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't drowning. For the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, this war wouldn't win. My last mission, I realized something that night. I had survived the war. Now, I had to survive the peace. And if telling my story could help another soldier, another lost soul struggling in the dark, then maybe that was my new mission, not to fight, not to run, but to speak, because some wars end, and some never do. Telling my story didn't erase the past. It didn't bring Carter back. It didn't take away the nightmares. It didn't make me whole again, but it did something else. It gave me purpose. I started sharing my story, at first, just with a notebook, then with other veterans. I met men who had walked the same path, fought the same battles. Some of them had never spoken about it before. Some of them were still trapped in their own silence. And I realized we were all carrying the same weight. Some of us just carried it alone. The weight of survival. There's a strange thing about surviving. People say you should feel lucky, that you should be grateful, but they don't understand the guilt that comes with it. Why did I make it when Carter didn't? Why did I come home when so many never got the chance? Why do I get to breathe this air, see this sky, walk these streets when others gave everything? That guilt can crush you. But I had a choice. I could let it bury me, or I could use it. For them, for Carter, for every name etched into the stone of a memorial, for every soldier who never got to see their family again. The road ahead. I still wake up some nights, gasping for air. I still hear echoes of the past in the silence. But now, I don't fight it. I let myself remember, because forgetting them would be the real betrayal. Some wars never end, but that doesn't mean they have to define us. I survived, and now I will make sure their stories do too.